5 shocking facts about the criminals who escaped justice after World War II. I'll never forget the day I heard that. It was late at night, and I was reviewing some old files in a small, forgotten library when an old man approached. His voice was low, almost a whisper, filled with guilt. He said, "You're wasting your time with those who were tried. The worst are still out there. One of them lives nearby. And no one has the courage to touch him." That froze me. My heart raced. I didn't know if he was joking, raving, or revealing something the entire world chose to ignore. But in that moment I knew. There was more. Much more. Criminals who escaped. Faces that disappeared, stories buried. That was where my obsession began. This wouldn't just be a search for justice. It would be a journey into the dark alleys of history, where monsters lurk, protected by silence. Subscribe, leave a like. Most people, when they think of World War II, imagine frozen black and white scenes. Soldiers marching, tanks blasting through ruins, furious speeches echoing from old radios. They believe the war ended in 1945, that the guilty were tried, convicted, and hanged in Nuremberg. But it was different for me. Since I was little, I heard whispers. My grandmother kept a box of letters under her bed, where German names appeared next to words like Brazil, Argentina, protection, church. Whenever I asked, she looked away. Once she murmured, "Not all monsters die in the end." I didn't understand at the time, but those words were etched on me like an invisible scar. Years later, as an adult, I returned to that house after her death, found the box, and inside there was more than I expected. Photos, newspaper clippings, letters written in Old German, scribbled hastily, as if someone were afraid of being read. It was then that I realized that my family, unwittingly, had been witness, perhaps complicit, perhaps just bystanders, to something much larger. A network, trail, a hiding place that reached far beyond the ruins of Europe. I decided I needed to understand. I began searching, became obsessed. I spent entire nights reading declassified documents, intelligence agency files, banned books, academic articles that few have the patience to decipher. What I discovered was terrifying. Hundreds of Nazi criminals escaped, not by luck, but by help. Help from governments, churches, sympathizers. They fled with new documents, clean identities, fake smiles. And do you know the most absurd thing? Some became teachers, doctors, businessmen. Some even helped modern dictatorships build their own systems of repression. These men, and yes, they were men, almost always men, didn't just escape justice. They rebuilt lives. Comfortable, protected lives. While their victims rotted in oblivion. Have you ever had that feeling of walking down an ordinary street, seeing a simple house, and suddenly feeling a chill? As if something there didn't belong. That's how it felt when I first arrived in Bariloche, Argentina. A peaceful town surrounded by mountains. But I knew what I was looking for. And when I entered an old, abandoned inn, I found a framed photo, forgotten behind a closet. It was his face. The same face I'd seen in a German dossier marked with the word fugitive. It was like a punch in the gut. It was real. They were there. They always had been. And for some reason, no one did anything. This search transformed me. I stopped seeing the world in black and white. I realized that justice is fragile, that the systems that should protect the truth sometimes hide it. And that memory, our collective memory, is shorter than we imagine. I know I'm exposing myself by telling this. Some people have sent me strange messages. Others have called me crazy, obsessed, someone who should leave the past alone. But how can I? How can I forget the face of a woman who lost her parents in Treblinka and discovered, 60 years later, that the man responsible lived next door to her, in the same city? How can I remain silent when I see documents showing that mass murderers were hired by democratic governments in exchange for information? No, can't. That's why I'm here. Not to entertain, but to remember. And if you've come this far with me, then perhaps you too feel this calling. This nagging need to tear away the veil of oblivion. I'm going to tell you the 5 cases that have impacted me the most. 5 truths that kept me awake at night. 5 names that should be in the history books, as a warning. But that disappeared into the dungeons of impunity. Get ready. From now on, there's no turning back. Subscribe, like, and comment. The name Mengele had already haunted me even before I understood the weight it carried. But nothing prepared me for the moment I saw his face for the first time. It was in an Argentine dossier, in black and white, pasted into a yellowed report that seemed to have been purposely forgotten. Cold eyes, thin eyebrows, faint smile, almost ironic. I found myself staring at that photo for minutes. It was as if he were watching me back. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, responsible for brutal medical experiments on children, pregnant women, twins. Someone who injected ink into victims' eyes just to see what would happen. Someone who sent patients to the gas chambers with the same coldness with which a doctor prescribes painkillers. And yet he escaped. His escape route wasn't a total mystery, but what bothered me most was how easy it had been. After the fall of the Third Reich, Mengele fled to southern Germany, was briefly captured by the Americans, but released due to lack of identification. They didn't know who he was. And then he disappeared. With the help of the so-called Rattlin, a secret escape network set up by Nazi sympathizers, supported by members of the Catholic Church and protected in South American countries, Mengele set sail for South America. First, Argentina, then Paraguay, and finally Brazil. Yes, Brazil. My country. My homeland. I remember the lump in my throat when I discovered he lived here for years. And no one touched him. It was in 2017 that I decided to follow in his footsteps. I went to Serra Negra in the interior of Sao Paulo, and then to Caieiras, where, according to cross-referenced records, he had lived under the name Dr. Jose. I stayed in a simple hotel, rented an old car, and spent days walking the streets, talking to old residents. Many avoided me. Others pretended not to remember. But a woman, now in her 90s, called me into her house. "You're looking for the German doctor, right?" she said. Felt a shiver. She pointed to an old portrait, with a family in the background and a man in a white suit. That was him. Very polite, but strange. He never took pictures with anyone. He disappeared for weeks. The confirmation came in a detail. On his tombstone, found years later in Embu das Artes, the DNA matched the German medical archives. It was Mengele. He drowned on an ordinary day on an ordinary beach, without being tried, without being held accountable. What revolts me most isn't just the fact that he escaped. It's the silence that surrounded him. Authorities knew. The Mossad came close but gave up. The Vatican had clues but didn't act. The Brazilian government. Well, the archives say everything without saying anything. You know what that tells me? That the world didn't want justice. It wanted oblivion. And Mengele enjoyed every second of it. They say he continued doing research during his exile. That he never expressed regret. That he boasted of having deceived the world. And looking at his photo, that strange frozen smile, I believe it. When I returned from my trip, I looked in the mirror and saw a different man. A tired man, as if he had gazed into the depths of an abyss. And the abyss had returned his gaze. I understood then that evil does not die with the end of a war. Changes its name, its address, its clothes. But it remains. And while we forget, it survives. Joseph Mengele escaped justice. But he will not escape memory. Not as long as I continue to tell this story. One of the things that haunts me most about this story is that Joseph Mengele never escaped alone. He didn't escape by luck, nor by a stroke of genius. He was protected, helped, guided as if he were a priest on a sacred mission. And those who helped him were men who claimed to be of God, of honor, of values. But they were more concerned with ideology than with justice. Over time, I discovered that Mengele's escape was planned with surgical precision, like his experiments. 2 names emerged in the archives I consulted in Munich: Bishop Alois Hudel and Otto Wachter, priests and officers linked to the so-called Rat Line. an underground network that connected monasteries, convents, and secret passages in Rome to the ports of Genoa. The mission? To get war criminals out of Europe before the Allies reached them. I discovered a recently declassified CIA report that described how these routes worked. Fake passports, usually from the Red Cross, were distributed with legitimate stamps provided by sympathizers within the Vatican. Mengele, for example, received Red Cross passport number 100,896, with the name Helmut Greger. Greger was a fictitious worker, raised in a convent in Bolzano, northern Italy. The most disturbing part: this document was recognized and accepted by Argentine authorities without any verification. He embarked from Genoa to Buenos Aires in 1949, with a visa, with support, with money, and with an entire world ready to pretend they saw nothing. Years later, on a trip to Austria, I met an elderly historian, the kind of man who collected forgotten truths as if they were sacred relics. He showed me a handwritten letter sent from Buenos Aires to Rome. In it, Mengele thanked them for providence and the protection of the Holy House. He spoke of his scattered brothers and mentioned Eichmann and Roth as potential companions. It was a code, but a code clear enough for anyone to read. The Vatican knew, and it preferred to protect ideology over justice. In Brazil, the story continued. Mengele was sheltered by wealthy German families, many of them Nazi sympathizers. I spoke with a retired lawyer in Sao Paulo who admitted, with shame, that his father lent false documents to special immigrants. Everyone knew who Joseph was, he said, but no one dared say it out loud. Protection didn't just come from secrecy, it came from collective silence, a comfortable silence, fueled by fear and convenience. Think about it. How could one of the most wanted men on the planet live for decades in freedom, without being captured? There's only one answer. Someone powerful wanted him to go free. And that someone wasn't a person. It was a system. A system made up of institutions, of accomplices, of dirty ideologies dressed in sacred clothing. Mengele only managed to disappear because the world turned a blind eye. Because after the war the focus shifted. Cold War began. And suddenly, former Nazis became strategic assets. Information was worth more than justice. And murderers like Mengele were just pieces on a new political chessboard. It's easy to think that evil lurks in the darkness. But the truth is crueler. Evil sometimes lives in broad daylight, sitting right beside us, celebrated as a hero by those who share its hidden values, and protected by an invisible network that feeds on our indifference. When I left Caieiras, after visiting the house where Mengele spent his final years, I stopped in front of a simple square where children played. And I wondered, how many others still live like this? Hidden, forgotten, and free? The answer, unfortunately, would come with the next name on my list. Have you ever heard of Walter Roth? Few people have, and that in itself says a lot. Roth wasn't a famous face like Himmler or Goebbels. He didn't appear in Hitler's fiery speeches or Grace propaganda posters. But he was responsible for one of the most cruel inventions in modern history. Gas trucks. Trucks, yes, ordinary vehicles adapted to kill. Closed inside, hermetically sealed, where the victims, often women, children, entire families, were placed, crammed together. And instead of being taken somewhere, they were asphyxiated by carbon monoxide, directly from the exhaust. Slow death, suffocating, silent, and mobile, horror on wheels. And Walter Roth was the one who designed all of this. With mathematical coldness, with technical pride, as if he were optimizing a production line. The first time I read about him, I felt disgusted. But what really broke me was his fate. Because Walter Roth also escaped. And like Mengele, he not only lived for many years in freedom, he was protected, recruited, employed. Yes, you heard right. After the war, Roth was taken in by European intelligence services. He worked for the Italian Secret Service and then, guess what? For West Germany itself. But it was in Chile that he found his true refuge. During the Pinochet regime, Rolf lived as a respected citizen. He obtained citizenship. He owned a company. And most frighteningly, he provided consulting services to the dictatorship's death squads. In other words, he didn't just escape justice. He continued teaching how to kill. In 2018, I traveled to Santiago. I wanted to see with my own eyes where this man had lived. I found the house, modest with high walls, in the northern part of the city, near an elementary school. I stood there staring for minutes. Imagine how many times he must have passed children on the sidewalk. Neighbors who had no idea who he was. Or worse, who knew and simply pretended not to know. I spoke with a local historian. He told me that for years, Germany tried to extradite Rolf, but Chile denied it. It said the statute of limitations had expired. Statutory. As if the murder of thousands of people could expire. During my research, I came across a shocking testimony. A Polish survivor, who lost her entire family in the gas trucks, said, "I would have preferred they had died in a field. At least they would have a grave." But Rolf's victims, they disappeared. They went up in smoke. Literally. And he died in 1984, at age 77. With a funeral, with tributes, and with total impunity. His crimes were never tried. He was never convicted. He never showed remorse. In fact, he once told a journalist, "My conscience is clear. I was only following orders." How many times have you heard that phrase? It has become the monster's favorite shield. When I returned to the hotel that night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about the gears. The coldness with which Rolf must have designed the first prototypes of those trucks. The graph paper. The calculations of asphyxiation time. The methodical way he organized the workings of death. That was what tormented me most. Not the blood, but the absence of emotion. Murder transformed into a technical task. And the world once again allowed it. Fell silent. And moved on as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the victims' faces continue to fade from our collective memory. But Rolf's is engraved in me. And now, it's engraved in you too. I couldn't accept it. I couldn't understand how Walter Rolf, a man who literally designed an industrial method of murder, could live peacefully until he was 77, drinking coffee on Chilean balconies and reading the newspaper. So I began to dig deeper, much deeper. I began to follow the trail of diplomacy, correspondence, the dirty hand-scribbled documents hidden in folders that time had nearly swallowed. It was then that I began to understand. Walter Rolf wasn't just a fugitive. He was an asset, a valuable piece in the new geopolitical game that emerged after the war. The Cold War. And when the world divided between the US and the USSR, the old moral rules lost their hold. What really mattered was, do you have something useful to offer? So, then you live. Even if he's a monster. Rolf was found in Chile in 1960. At the same time that Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, was captured by the Mossad in Argentina. There was a hope, however remote, that Rolf would meet the same fate. But his fate was different. West Germany filed a formal extradition request. Chile, then under the democratic government of Jorge Alessandri, denied it. The argument: the crimes were statute barred. Statute barred. A dry, bureaucratic, unbearable word. I remember the first time I read that opinion. My hands were shaking. It wasn't possible. As if time had the power to erase mobile gas chambers, suffocated children, destroyed families. As if the years could cleanse the hands of a serial killer. I continued investigating. And I began to understand that Chile's refusal wasn't just a legal issue. It was politics. Walter Rolf was welcome there. Especially after 1973. With Augusto Pinochet's military coup. Under that regime, men like Rolf weren't considered criminals. They were considered experts, consultants, silent mentors of repressive techniques. I discovered, with the help of a Chilean journalist who preferred to remain anonymous, that RAF had guided sectors of the DINA, Pinochet's secret police, in the use of interrogation techniques. It's a disgusting euphemism for torture. The same coldness with which he designed gas trucks, he now applied in dark concrete cells. I went to the Chilean Supreme Court building, where the historical cases are archived. The security guard looked at me suspiciously. I showed him my researcher's badge. After a few hours, with authorization, I was given access to copies of the German request and the Chilean decision. It was all official, dry, impersonal. But behind the legal words, there was a cruel truth. Chile never wanted to hand over RAF. And what's more, the West never really put pressure. No one wanted to confront Pinochet. And behind the scenes, everyone knew RAF was still useful. The same nations that tried criminals at Nuremberg now turned a blind eye. I sat on a bench in a square in front of the courthouse. I watched the city's hustle and bustle. People hurried, cars passing, mothers with children in their arms. And I thought, how many of these people know what happened here? How many know that, for decades, justice was buried under the weight of diplomacy and self-interest? And how many really care? That was the question that hurt me the most. 'Cause the truth is, the world has moved on. As it always does. And monsters, when they're not hunted, learn to walk among us. They change faces, their names, their countries, but they continue to exist. Walter Roth died in 1984. Cause of death, heart attack. Location, his comfortable home in Santiago. Burial, discreet but dignified. He never faced a court. He never apologized. He was never punished. And even more frightening, he never stopped believing in what he did. He never regretted it. In an informal interview, years before he died, he reportedly said, "I did what was necessary. If it wasn't me, it would be someone else." That phrase haunts me. The normalization of evil. The dilution of responsibility. The idea that horror is inevitable, like rain, like wind. But it isn't. Horror doesn't happen on its own. It's constructed, planned, executed. And in cases like Roth's, it's also protected. I remember the day I first saw the photos of Montluc prison. The small cells, the stained walls, the iron doors with ancient locks. There, in Lyon, hundreds of men, women, and even children endured torture sessions under the command of a single man. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. That's what they called him. And if you've ever felt the weight of a word, butcher is one of those words that tastes like rust in your mouth. But he didn't seem to mind the nickname. In fact, he seemed to relish it, as if it were a badge. Title of honor. Barbie was head of the Gestapo in Lyon, occupied France. Directly responsible for more than 4,000 deaths. He sent tens of thousands of people to concentration camps. And when I say ordered, I'm not just talking about signatures. Barbie tortured personally, with his own hands. I've seen accounts from survivors who described his face as that of a cold but methodical man. He never shouted. He spoke softly. He liked to break others psychologically before letting them bleed out. And his specialty, it seems, was destroying hope. He gouged out eyes. He hung bodies from the ceiling for hours. He tortured children in front of their mothers. And then he smiled. There was something particularly perverse in his way of acting. It wasn't impulsiveness. It was calculation. It was pleasure. After the war, you'd expect a man like that to be hunted like an animal, tried, and sentenced to death. But the fate that awaited him was different. Shortly after the fall of the Reich, Barbie was briefly captured by the Americans. But then came the twist. He was recruited by the United States Intelligence Service, the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC. In that new post-war world, where fear of communism outweighed the desire for justice, Barbie became a strategic asset. He had valuable information. He knew how the resistance worked, knew routes, names, techniques. And that was enough. The Americans protected him. They gave him a salary. And when France began pressing for his extradition, they helped him escape. I found declassified documents that confirm. In 1951, with direct help from the CIC, Klaus Barbie was put aboard a ship bound for Bolivia. Under the assumed name of Klaus Altmann, he had a new identity, a new passport, and the same rotten heart. And there, in La Paz, Barbie began a new life. Not in hiding, not cowed, but as a respected citizen. He worked as a security consultant. He did business with the Bolivian government. And, ironically, he helped hunt down and eliminate political dissidents, using the same techniques he perfected in occupied France. In other words, Barbie didn't just escape justice. He prospered with the help of those who were supposed to stop him. Years later, when I went to Bolivia, I tried to reconstruct his life story there. I spoke with old residents. Some remembered Mr. Altmann, polite, reserved, an important man, they said. When I showed them Barbie's real photo, a woman with sunken eyes told me, "My father said he wasn't who he said he was." But nobody wanted trouble. That phrase kept ringing in my head. Nobody wanted trouble. And that's what kept Klaus Barbie free for over 30 years. Fear, complacency, and silence. But unlike Mengele and Roth, Barbie didn't die unpunished. In 1983, after intense international pressure, he was finally extradited to France, tried for crimes against humanity, sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in 1991 in a cell in Lyon, just a few kilometers from the place where he terrorized so many lives. Many people see this as an act of justice. But for me, it was too late, decades too late. Most of his victims were already dead, others forgotten. And during that time, Barbie lived in freedom. He built wealth, he had influence, and he watched from a front row seat as the world turned its back on the past. I left Montluc prison with a bitter taste in my mouth. History teaches us many things, but sometimes it also shows us how easy it is to forget, and how dangerous it is to forgive the unforgivable in the name of greater interests. Klaus Barbie was one of the cruelest faces of the 20th century, but still someone looked at him and saw usefulness, and that haunts me to this day, because it makes me wonder, how many more like him were spared? How many still walk around, smiling under false names? And worse, how many were protected, not despite what they did, but precisely because of what they did? The first time I entered a secret state archive, I realized that true horror doesn't live in movies. It's not in the screams or the gas chambers. It's in the silence, in the bureaucracy, in the dry sound of paper being turned, in the coldness of stamp, in the impassiveness of signatures that changed or took lives. It was in Berlin, in a dark, almost forgotten building in the middle of a tree-lined street. The structure of the building didn't attract attention, but inside were shelved scars. After months of exchanging emails, presenting documents and statements, and interviewing historians and analysts, I received authorization to consult part of the archives of the former Stasi, the East German secret police, and also of a recently liberated section of the BND, the West German intelligence service. I signed confidentiality agreements. I was searched. And finally, I was escorted to a freezing room, where 3 boxes awaited me. My hands were shaking. Not fear, but something deeper. An instinctive feeling that I was about to see something I shouldn't have. Inside the first box were typed reports, internal memos, newspaper clippings with handwritten notes. In the second, coded names, lists of false passports issued by the Red Cross with the help of Austrian clergymen. But it was in the third box that I found what destroyed me. A document bearing the CIA seal. Date: 1950. Subject: strategic use of former Reich agents for operations in Eastern Europe. There was a list. Clear. Impressively direct. Joseph Mengele. Useful but uncontrollable. Walter Roth. Possible asset for operations in Chile. Klaus Barbie. In cooperation with the CIC. High value in anti-communist interrogations. And at the end of each line there was only one note: dry. Monitor, do not interfere. It made me sick, because for a moment I wished it were a lie, that it were a forgery, but the stamps were there, the signatures too, and the analysts' names matched legitimate historical sources. It was all real, everything, and it hurt more than any photo of a dead body I'd ever seen, because there before my eyes was the naked truth. It wasn't carelessness, it wasn't incompetence, it was choice. These men were knowingly protected, with full knowledge of what they had done. In the next room, a historian with me tried to console me. She said these were different times, that the world was on the brink of a new conflict, and difficult decisions needed to be made. But how could this be justified? How could thousands of lives be weighed against geopolitical strategy? How could I accept that a child killed in a gas tanker was worth less than a folder of information about a Soviet general? There I realized it wasn't just an investigation. It was a fight against a truth the world had already swallowed and digested. A truth no one wanted to face anymore. Justice was never the priority, only the balance of power. I stayed in that room for hours. The world outside continued. People walked, lived, smiled. But I was frozen. I read and reread those reports as if somehow I could change what was written. As if, by understanding every comma, I could prevent what had happened. But it was too late. And the feeling of helplessness was unbearable. When I left the building, the sky was cloudy. The city remained normal. But inside me something had broken. And it would never be the same again. From that day on, I stopped romanticizing the idea of justice. I understood that it is selective, fragile, and often subordinate. These documents taught me more than any history lesson. They showed me that monsters don't just live in basements. Some live behind desks. They wear ties. They speak softly. They sign papers. And they shake hands stained with blood, as long as that blood serves a purpose. And perhaps that was the cruelest revelation of all. Sometimes I find myself wondering, how can someone escape international justice, cross oceans, change their name, and live for decades as an ordinary citizen? And the deeper I delved into this investigation, the more shocked I was by the answer, because there were countries that opened their doors, on purpose, with conviction, with enthusiasm, and even more frightening, with pride. They weren't just hiding places. They were strongholds, carefully chosen havens. Some became veritable sanctuaries for war criminals. Argentina. It was always the first name that appeared in the files. And not without reason. The regime of Juan Domingo Perón, which ruled with a strong hand and ambitions of grandeur, saw an opportunity in the Nazis. It not only welcomed former officers, it facilitated their entry. With documentation, housing, employment. It was an exchange. They offered military experience, networks, money. And in return they received a new life. With a cleared name. History erased. Families started again. I even visited Bariloche, where several fugitives from the Third Reich supposedly lived. Wooden houses, alpine architecture. It looked like a Bavarian village transplanted to the Andes. But what chilled me most was the silence. It was a dense, heavy silence, as if everyone there knew, and no one dared say anything. Then came Paraguay, little talked about but equally complicit. Under Alfredo Stroessner's regime, the country became a transit route and a permanent haven. It was the route between Argentina and Brazil, and many criminals used its porous borders to escape investigation. In Asunción, I entered an old bookstore, where I found an out-of-print edition of a local book that listed the names of foreigners naturalized between 1946 and 1960. The coincidences with Nazi names were glaring. Some records had disappeared, others were erased. But the feeling was clear. Their history had been manipulated with surgical care, as if someone knew from the beginning that one day someone like me would come looking. And then Brazil. The place where I was born, where I grew up, and where I discovered that impunity also had deep roots. I'm not just talking about Mengele, I'm talking about dozens of names. Men who arrived discreetly, settled in the south of the country, bought small properties, and lived as good neighbors. The community protected them. The police ignored them. The records almost always disappeared. In one of the cases I investigated, I found a German doctor who worked for 30 years in a public hospital in Santa Catarina. He was never reported. He was never investigated. But, according to cross-referenced files, he was one of those responsible for medical selections in camps in occupied Poland. What shocked me most, the tributes he received when he retired. A street named after him, photo on the hospital wall, moving speeches about ethics and humanitarian service. And then I realized, these countries weren't just complicit. They were proud accomplices. They used the Nazis, and then hid them as if they were invisible trophies, trading blood for knowledge, memory for convenience, justice for power. And to this day there are those who deny it, those who say this is a conspiracy theory. But I was there. I saw the papers, photos, evidence, and once you see it, you can never close your eyes the same way again. Nothing prepared me for that encounter. I had already gone through archives, documents, reports, but I never imagined I would be able to speak to someone who had actually seen Joseph Mengele with my own eyes. It was a gray morning in Sao Paulo, the kind of day where the light seems to fade, and everything seems heavier. I received a recommendation from an elderly man who lived in a remote neighborhood, someone who had lived during the time when Mengele roamed freely throughout Brazil. When I knocked on the door, a frail man with tired eyes and a slow voice answered. He seemed to carry a lifetime on his shoulders, and perhaps that was true. We sat in the small living room of his house, surrounded by walls covered in old photographs and mementos from a time he preferred not to revisit. He looked at me for a long time, assessing whether I was worthy of his trust. Then, in a low voice, he began to speak. I saw him, yes. Joseph Mengele. My heart raced. How? Where? He took a deep breath. It was in Embu das Artes, in the late 1960s. I worked in a small market near the church. He would come in from time to time, alone, always with that cold, emotionless look. He never talked much. He would just buy cigarettes and go home. I never saw anyone approach him. He always seemed distant, as if he were waiting for something. As he spoke, I felt the weight of the story fall upon me like a storm. It was real. The angel of death was there, living among ordinary people, hidden in plain sight. He told me about the fear that hung over the German community in that area. We knew who he was, but no one spoke. The law of silence, the fear of the past that never went away. He revealed to me that Mengele had once been seen visiting a local hospital, supposedly for treatment, but no one could say exactly what. Little by little, that mysterious man became a legend in the neighborhood, a ghost who walked the streets with a deadly secret. In that instant, I realized that Mengele's greatest nightmare was not human justice, but oblivion. While he fled the law, he also fled his own past. And those who knew of his presence preferred to ignore it, burying the truth under layers of fear and silence. When I finished listening to his story, I thanked him silently, my eyes welling up. I knew I carried something precious, a living witness, a tenuous thread connecting past and present. And that day, more than ever, I understood. Telling these stories is a duty, a cry against oblivion, against impunity, against the pain that insists on repeating itself when we don't face what happened. From the moment I began investigating these stories, one thing haunted me, the feeling that justice was always one step behind, that no matter how hard agents, Nazi hunters, and governments tried, the system conspired to ensure that these men would never be truly caught. The international hunt sounded grand in newspapers, books, and films. But behind the spotlight, there was foul play, a tangle of vested interests, silent agreements, and invisible hands that preferred impunity. I remember a meeting I attended in Vienna, in a former Interpol building, where historians and officials discussed the files of war criminals not yet captured. Among them, I heard stories of failed attempts, of lost documents, of countries that refused to cooperate. It was like trying to hunt a ghost with your hands tied. A ghost that changed face, name, and country, always one step ahead of the law. In one of these stories, I recalled the frustrating search for Eichmann, who was only captured because a group of Israeli agents violated Argentina's sovereignty. But for many others, not even that happened. For years, I followed the work of Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal, men who dedicated their lives to finding these shadows of the past. And I heard in their voices the exhaustion, the frustration of an unequal struggle. In many cases, the governments involved, supposedly allies in the pursuit of justice, ended up putting the brakes on. Political pressure, diplomatic agreements, fear of exposure. It was as if the real persecution was more of a spectacle than a real priority. The impression was clear. Justice was flexible, selective, often silenced. I searched for secret documents that showed how certain intelligence agencies used former Nazis as pawns in the Cold War. They had valuable information, strategic contacts. So, instead of bringing these criminals to justice, they hid them, recruited them. Meanwhile, victims and survivors had to live with the pain of abandonment, of forced oblivion, of complicit silence. This reality left me speechless, but with renewed determination. Closer to Brazil, I found reports of clandestine operations to protect fugitives, facilitate their new lives, and cover their tracks. I saw how the bureaucracy of the Brazilian authorities at the time collaborated, directly or indirectly, with this network of impunity. In some cases, public officials didn't even question the false identities presented. It was a carefully orchestrated system to ensure that the monsters of the past could breathe free, away from the eyes of justice. The hunt never ended because it was never serious. War criminals were valuable pieces on the board of international politics, protected by a network that operated in the shadows, where strategic interests outweighed human lives. As the clock ticked toward the end of World War II, the Shadow War began. And in it, justice was the first sacrifice. Sometimes I wonder, how many still escape today? How many changed faces still live among us, hidden by a curtain of silence and fear? And how many stories like this, full of horror and impunity, remain buried under piles of paper, waiting to be discovered? This hunt for me is not over. And as long as I breathe, it will not end. Because justice may be delayed, but it cannot fail. And because some truths need to be told, even if no one wants to hear them. As I delved deeper into the story of these criminals who escaped justice, I began to realize something that doesn't appear in history books or official documentaries. It's not just about them, the fugitives, but about those left behind. The victims. The families torn apart by silence, by abandonment, by the lack of answers. These stories hit me in a very personal way. I found myself thinking of all the people who lost loved ones to cold, unpunished hands, and who never even had the chance for a dignified burial, for real justice. In a small town in Poland, I met Anna. She was over 80 years old, her face lined with tears and heavy memories. Her father had been one of the victims of Walter Roff's gas trucks. She told me, her voice breaking, that to this day she can smell that smoke that carried people away without a trace. I could never cry for him, she said, because I never had a grave. I never had a place to go when I missed him. The absence of a body, of a symbol, transformed the pain into something ethereal, impossible to put an end to. The lack of a trial, the prolonged impunity, created an immense void in the collective memory. For many, the pain was silenced for decades, and the feeling of injustice turned into shame, fear, and even guilt. I heard stories of families who had to hide their origins to avoid stigmatization, others who lost faith in human justice, and all of them, without exception, carried an invisible weight that spanned generations. This wounded memory is not just a past, it's a present. It's an invisible thread that connects victims, survivors, their children and grandchildren. I could feel this myself when I spoke with descendants who still fight to keep their family's story alive. They seek recognition. They want the world not to forget. But they feel alone. as if this fight were against an invisible wall. On several occasions, I have attended meetings of survivor groups, people who come together to share their pain and memories. In these meetings, silence weighs almost as much as words. They are memories of horrors, but also of resistance, of strength to move forward, even in the face of the silence of justice. One of these groups told me that impunity is not only a failure of the legal system, but a direct attack on the dignity of the victims. Hearing these voices, I realized that I cannot tell this story without talking about them, because they are the true reason we never let these wounds be forgotten. And that is why, as I seek to reveal the failures, mistakes, and betrayals of the past, I also commit to giving voice to those who were silenced, to keep their memory alive, to fight so that no war criminal can walk free again, and to remember that justice is not just an abstract concept, it is a fundamental human right. In the end, I understood that the real fight is not just against the monsters who escape justice. It is also against oblivion, against silence, against the indifference that allows these stories to repeat themselves, in different forms and times. And this fight begins within each of us, when we choose to remember, when we choose to tell, when we choose not to turn our backs on the pain of others. Therefore, I ask you to listen to me now. Don't let these stories disappear. Don't let silence win. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come with me on this journey. Because together, we can keep the flame of memory and justice alive, and ensure that the past, however dark, teaches us how to build a better future. I never imagined how dangerous a piece of paper could be. But as I delved deeper into the investigation of the criminals who escaped justice after World War II, I discovered that the key to impunity lay precisely there. In sophisticated networks of forgery, in documents that gave these men a new life, a new face, a new story. It was as if the truth had been erased with a simple stamp. In one of the archives I consulted, I found a collection of fake passports, identity cards, birth certificates, and even medical diplomas, all meticulously produced, with an almost artistic care. There were even documents issued by the International Red Cross. Yes, the very institution that was supposed to save lives, which, in collusion with certain corrupt clergy and officials, helped provide these false identities. This left me completely stunned. It was an organized international network that crossed borders and continents. More than documents, it was a web of lies and betrayals. Each false name had a carefully constructed story. They were given jobs, citizenships, families. It was as if the past could be erased, replaced by a new script. And all this while thousands of victims remained without answers, without justice. I went to the Vatican, or at least what I could access about the actions of certain members of the clergy during that period. Secret documents revealed that some priests and bishops, under the pretense of spiritual protection, facilitated the escape of Nazis. There were even records of escape routes called ratlines, the rat lines, which were clandestine passages organized to transport criminals to countries like Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. Fear, ideology, and, in some cases, economic self-interest, created a shadowy system of escape and concealment. I met a former Red Cross employee who confided in me about the internal pressure to issue false documents. It was a matter of saving lives, he said. But his words were tinged with doubt and remorse. He saved lives, yes. But which ones? The same ones that took innocent lives. It was a cruel paradox, an act that blended compassion and complicity. Each false document I found was like a pulled thread that revealed an even larger knot. The number of people involved, the political and administrative collusion, was frightening. It made me think about how vulnerable our idea of truth is when it depends on paper and stamps. And even more frightening, how easy it is for impunity to hide behind bureaucracy. As I reflected on all this, I realized that these networks didn't just save criminals. They also saved a system that preferred the convenience of lies to the responsibility of justice. And to this day, these invisible marks continue to shape our perception of the past and of the present. Because in the end, behind every false document, there is a true story. A story of horror, of escape, and of abandonment. And now, I ask you who are listening, How many of these false documents are still circulating? How many faces have changed? How many lives have been rebuilt at the cost of the pain of others? These questions keep me awake at night and compel me to continue this search, however dark and painful it may be. When I began delving into the stories of these criminals who escaped justice, I didn't expect that one of the most painful parts would be hearing from those who survived and who still carry an open wound, a void that has never been filled by justice. I met survivors, their children and grandchildren, who welcomed me with a mixture of hope and bitterness. They wanted to be heard. They wanted their voices to echo beyond the walls of silence that the world has imposed. I remember a particularly striking encounter in Israel. I went to a small community where a group of survivors gathered to remember, support each other, and, above all, demand justice. Through tears, a woman recounted how her brother had been taken to a concentration camp, and how she had never even received an official answer about his fate. "Justice," she repeated, her voice breaking. "We've waited for it all our lives, and it never came." The frustration in that room was palpable, a mixture of sadness, anger, and disbelief. I was impressed by the strength of these people. Despite everything they had been through, they still fought for recognition, for reparations, for truth. But at the same time they felt betrayed. Betrayed by a system that, on many occasions, chose to protect the guilty, hide documents, and discredit witnesses. This feeling of abandonment was a shadow that haunted them daily. Talking with them, I realized that the failure of justice wasn't just a legal problem. It was a deep emotional wound. It was the feeling that the world, which promised never to forget, chose to look the other way when reality became uncomfortable. "It's as if our pain were invisible to them," said a man, his eyes brimming with tears. "As if our memories were trash to be discarded." I also saw how this frustration reverberated among subsequent generations. Children and grandchildren carry not only the legacy of trauma, but the ongoing struggle to keep their families' stories alive. They face the challenge of preserving memories against time, against denial, and against indifference. And often they feel alone in this mission. In one of these conversations, a young woman said something to me that has stayed with me forever. "It's not just about justice for the dead. It's about justice for the living who still carry this burden." And in that moment, I understood that my mission wasn't just to tell stories of monsters on the run. It was also to give voice to these broken hearts. It was a reminder that behind every name in a court case lies a life cut short, a family destroyed. Leaving these meetings always left me with a feeling of helplessness mixed with determination. Helplessness in the face of the magnitude of injustice. The determination to never let these voices be silenced. Because if justice fails, memory cannot fail. And if the world forgets, we must remember, with all the strength we have. Therefore, I invite you on the other side. Do not allow silence and impunity to gain ground. Subscribe to the channel, share these stories, be part of this fight. Because true justice begins when we choose to remember, and when we choose to never again allow impunity to triumph over the pain of the innocent. After everything I've discovered, after listening to so many silenced voices, after confronting documents that reveal betrayals and secrets, I can no longer look at justice the same way. It's fragile, sometimes painfully selective, and often clouded by interests that go far beyond what we imagine. But I've also learned that memory is a powerful weapon. That silence only serves those who want to hide the truth, and that telling these stories is a form of resistance. If these criminals escape justice, we cannot escape the responsibility to remember. Question: to fight so that this never happens again. Because every forgotten name is an open wound in our past, and worse, a warning for the present. Therefore, I ask you who are following me now, don't let this story disappear in time. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications. Share these stories with those who need to hear it. Together, we can keep the flame of memory and justice alive, even when the world seems to turn its back. Thank you for being with me this far. And remember, the truth can be hard, dark, and painful, but it is what gives us hope to build a future where justice is real for all.